I am Talay Ibrahim, and I am the Director of Academics at CSCI. I welcome you all to today's guest lecture on the topic Localizing the Knowledge Creation on South Asia via Western Knowledge Flawed. The motivation for today's lecture was that we, as students of international relations, as students of social sciences, use the terminologies that have been a part of Western discourse, and we come across them. We sort of make them a part of our research articles and our understanding, and our perception and our behavior towards the world politics gets affected by them. Just two examples, quick examples. We see the use of word terrorism, how it is used and how it affects our perception. Who is a good terrorist, who is a bad terrorist. Apart from that, as a security studies scholar, I see that much of our nuclear discourse in Pakistan has been heavily influenced by Western terminologies. So our understanding of what the nuclear deterrence is also contingent on what has been worked upon or written by the Western scholars and how they perceive the deterrence should be. So we apply it in Pakistan. So to sort of contemplate further on these incongruities, we have invited today Dr. Inderjeet Parmar and Dr. Ahmed Waqas Waheed to deliver this lecture. I'll introduce Dr. Inderjeet Parmar first. Dr. Inderjeet Parmar is a professor and head of international politics at City University of London and a fellow of the UK Academy of Social Sciences. He is the author of several books, including Foundations of the American Century. Dr. Parmar's research interests focus on the history, politics, and sociology of Anglo-American foreign policy elites, specifically embodied in philanthropic foundations, think tanks, universities, foreign affairs institutes, and state agencies. Then we have Dr. Ahmed Waqas Waheed, who is the Executive Director of the Research on Advancement and Development of Social Sciences Books Initiative. He has published widely with his latest book, Constructing Pakistan Through Knowledge Production, International Relations, Area Studies, published by the Belgrave Macmillan in 2020. He has also delivered academic and foreign policy oriented lectures and seminars in national and international forum. Very recently, he wrote a paper, Localizing Pakistan International Relations, which I assume is vacated, is behind the video. So, Dr. Inderjeet and Dr. Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll have 15 minutes each for your lecture, which will be followed by a Q&A session with our research. Starting from you, Dr. Inderjeet.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm very pleased and honored to be invited to address this audience. And it's always nice to be invited to share some ideas on the work that I've been doing for a little while. So what I thought I would do, if that's all right, is basically do three things in my remarks. The first one is really to look at the kind of idea about Western knowledge as a term, and look at the idea of flawed as a term. And then secondly, I want to apply that then to this idea of localizing knowledge in South Asia, on South Asia. And then what I would like to do is to sort of say a little bit about how Anglo-American and particularly American knowledge power works and how it has become so powerful and effective in regard to impact on the world beyond the United States. So just to take up in effect, to kind of break down the title of this session, you refer to Western knowledge, and you did in your opening remarks as well. And I think it's important to kind of see that actually sorry, can you all hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
All right, thank you. Western knowledge is actually not monolithic and homogeneous. It is actually quite varied. And what we usually refer to when we refer to Western knowledge, in effect, is elite Western knowledge. It's not the knowledge of your average Western person. It's the knowledge of embedded elites in the West. And when we talk about the West, particularly in countries where English is quite widely spoken amongst students, scholars, and other professionals and so on, we're talking about Anglo-American elite knowledge. So it's not even Western, it's Anglo-American. And even within that, it's largely American because they dominate the production of ideas, knowledge, and so on. So I think that's really important to kind of bear in mind, that the real power in regard to knowledge and knowledge production is held in relatively few hands. So what I think it's useful to sort of think about is asking ourselves some questions about knowledge. Knowledge for whom? Knowledge as in by whom? Who produces the knowledge and for whom is the knowledge produced? Who pays for the production of knowledge? And all of those, the answers to those questions suggest that knowledge isn't neutral, but it's part of the distribution and flows of power. And that factors like class, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and ideology play very important roles. Those who control large resources have very great influence over the production of ideas which go into the mainstream. Lots of people can produce ideas, but if you are part of a bureaucracy or an institution, so that when we look at which institutions produce knowledge, big knowledge, not just a few words here and there, a few articles here and there, it's university institutions, which are usually funded by states or other kinds of big donors. It's corporations, which have their research and development and other divisions. It's corporate media, which has its own paid for analysts and commentators and correspondents and so on. It's corporately funded think tanks who use their resources to define what is important and problematic in the world and so on. And it's governments or states and their political parties. That is to say that big knowledge is produced by big institutions. And those big institutions have their own interests in the production of knowledge. And the consequence of that is that knowledge is not necessarily flawed. And it's the second part of that, the title of the talk. Is Western knowledge flawed? I don't think it is flawed because it serves the interests of those producers. It may not help Pakistan, it may not help India or Indonesia or Chile or working class people in Britain. But the fact is that it is not flawed. It serves certain kinds of interests in a struggle, which you could call knowledge wars, information wars, political warfare, and so on. So we know that knowledge is an area, the contestation around what is good knowledge, sound knowledge, terminology, language, discourse, there's a big struggle around it, and it's impacted by who funds, who pays for, who produces. All of us are produced by history, produced by our background, our family, our education, our religion, our various values, and so on, but also by large resources, etc. So, in effect, elite Anglo-American knowledge is there in order to make the world legible, readable, comprehensible, and therefore controllable. So they can act on it in the way they claim that it actually develops and exists and so on. And so that is to say, they take knowledge power very, very seriously and invest very large resources in the production of knowledge. So just two quotes to illustrate that. A very famous scholar you will know, late Samuel P. Huntington, way back in 1970, wrote that what there is of an American empire was built through intellectual penetration, not territorial acquisition. That is to say that America's kind of global hegemonic position is not alone a military or an economic position, but it's also a cultural and intellectual and ideational position, and so on. Winston Churchill in 1943 noted that the empires of the future will be empires of the mind. So very large resources are invested in, if you like, empires of the mind, the making of empires of the mind. And you know when they've been successful, and incredibly successful, is that when you don't even know to ask questions about things, because the whole boundary of our intellect and our ideas and questions is already bounded so tightly that we find it difficult to think outside of it. And I think that is when you know there's an empire of knowledge or an empire of the mind, where you don't even know the certain questions you should be asking, and so on. So I would argue that when we look at Western knowledge, it's mainly Anglo-American and mainly American, and it is part of this kind of, if you like, it's called soft power very often in the terminology, Joseph Nye and so on and so forth. But there's nothing soft about it, because that so-called soft power is linked with massive coercive power. That hegemony, like Gramsci argued, hegemony is coercion and persuasion, and it's a balance between those two. When you look at the United States, it's the greatest coercive power that has ever existed, but it is also the greatest cultural power that has ever existed as well. And the combination of those two gives it very, very great leverage. So what I would say is, I go to the next part of this kind of localizing knowledge production in South Asia, the other part of the title of this session. The same kind of questions and criteria and critical analysis must apply. Who pays for knowledge production in South Asia? Who benefits from knowledge production in South Asia? Who is the producer of that knowledge? We are all products of our society, our segment of the society, our class background, and so on and so forth. We're products of history. And therefore, the questions we ask, the concerns that we have, and therefore the knowledge that we produce is impacted by those things. So what does localizing mean? Who in South Asia is local? Who counts as local? Is it the farmers? Is it lower caste people? Is it poor minorities? No, it isn't that. It's people who have access to great resources, who then decide what is the question, what is the problem, what is the crisis, who should study this crisis, what kind of methods should they use, and what are the frameworks within which they operate. So that is already, you have hemmed in and bounded what is likely to be found. And that is going to be a kind of problem-solving knowledge for the purposes of benefiting relatively few people. Of course, there are counter-hegemonies, and that is a really powerful force too, that groups of people who disagree, who don't get the benefits of that society, economy, polity, or whatever, who've been excluded or marginal, they also form their forms of knowledge, radical knowledge, critical knowledge, and forms of political organization. And there's a contestation. So if you like, knowledge production is always engaged in combat. Even if it's not overtly combating a specific idea, it is in effect, by existing, preventing the development of certain ways of thinking, because it dominates, becomes the norm, the orthodoxy, the natural way things are and should be seen. So, and I think therefore that knowledge itself is a kind of very deeply political kind of process, and it's involved in this sort of clash of interests which characterize most of our societies. So I would argue that in the title of the talk, there are a number of sort of taken for granted assumptions which just need to be sort of unraveled and unpacked a little bit, because it then unravels some of the other problematic idea that you can somehow unproblematically localize knowledge about South Asia in South Asia. South Asia is absolutely huge in terms of its population. India alone is about 1.3 billion people. Is that the knowledge that they're producing in New Delhi and Mumbai and the other think tanks which are getting lots of money from big companies? I don't think they are. Nor is the government producing knowledge of that sort. It's usually for control. So I think it's really important just to kind of do that, because I've written a lot about knowledge production, knowledge power in regard to the United States. And and that's perfectly fine. You can have a look at that in that book, particularly Foundations of the American Century. But I felt that when I looked at the title, I felt I should say one or two things about some of the problematic issues that raises. I hope that's okay. But I would like to say something, the third and final thing, is that that the real kind of secret that I feel has made Western or Anglo-American or American knowledge power so great and so significant and impactful in the world and on the United States itself is network power. And that is the key, in my view, that elite knowledge networks are probably the greatest achievement of the institutions of knowledge production. And those networks, if you like, they have internal functions. That is, they gather together people from a range of institutions with a range of knowledge production. Some of it is quite basic. It could be theoretical, it could be conceptual, it could be methodological. It doesn't sound like it is actually about that world, but it produces the sort of conceptual power which can be used to research the world and produce empirical knowledge about it. And then that empirical knowledge, because the network is not only knowledge producers, but also those who are policy entrepreneurs who take ideas and then package them in order to market them to political entrepreneurs who then shape them according to the publics to which they're directing those kinds of ideas into policies and strategies. So the internal functions of a network are in effect to create a little sort of subset in which basic research and applied research can be developed and thereby then radiate outwards. But it gives those people a privileged position. It gives them the surplus of that society is effectively invested in those people to give them time in universities, in think tanks, in foundations, in research forums, in governments and so on, and the interaction between them. So they finance journals, finance professional associations, finance, excuse me, conferences and so on. The places where people can sit and meet and effectively build what you could call a consensus. It doesn't mean to say everybody agrees, but they have a sort of bounded consensus within which people agree on the same way of approaching the problem, even if they disagree with a specific solution. So the internal kind of, if you like, function of a network is to create those people who have a career and a life from PhD through to the civil service or journalism or wherever it might be, policymakers, so that they live the life of the idea and the idea into practice, and they're able to sustain a life, a livelihood, and a career. It's the material basis for knowledge power production. Their external functions are clear. They basically are the prestigious knowledge. When the TV people say what's going on in X or Y or Z, it's these people that they go to. The talking heads on the television are drawn from those elite institutions which have been funded to produce that kind of knowledge, which is legible to those elite media institutions. And when you plot the leadership of think tanks, of foundations, of corporations, of media entities, university heads and their boards and donors and so on, who do you find? You find a revolving door among the elites where they move around and they shape the consensus in which they operate. And they refer to each other as the experts, which then reproduce that world, which they have already produced in various ways in the first place. And I would say that that combination of internal and external networks, it's a material network, but it's also ideational. So it takes a lot of money. To have networks, you need flows of money, flows of people, and flows of ideas. And that takes a very large amount of resource over time in production of this intelligentsia, which can live off ideas. They don't have to grow their food. They don't have to work in a factory or anything else. They live off the production of ideas, and somebody pays them to do that. They're subsidized to produce ideas. And that's what the United States is able to do spectacularly well. it has developed an entire layer of institutions. And I think one of the reasons why the United States is probably the most developed along those lines is because it emerged as a new nation. Unlike the Western European states and societies, it didn't have a centralized state. It didn't have a powerful state, it had limited government. It didn't have a permanent civil service. It still doesn't really have a permanent civil service. So what they did, they developed an American solution to that problem. So whereas in Britain, somebody would join the Foreign Office at the age of 21 or 22 and work in some division of that Foreign Office for 30 years as their career and become an expert on the Middle East or Africa or whatever it might be, the United States doesn't have that. But what they've done is they've created the think tanks and the institutes and the universities and other places in which those people can be employed to think about the problems of the state, the society, the economy, and the world of the United States. And then every time there's an election and a change of president, some part of that whole kind of ecosystem moves into the CIA, the National Security Council, or the State Department, or the Pentagon, or whatever it might be. That is to say, they've got a privatized version of a centralized state civil service. So we look at India, maybe Pakistan, and Britain, France, Germany, and others. They have very heavily centralized states. Therefore, they have less of an ecosystem outside of the state thinking about the problems of the state, because they're largely doing it in-house. The United States is largely doing out of the house. They've got a particular way in which they've developed historically, but it has been very powerful. And that, if you like, that knowledge power, I would argue, transformed the United States from a very much kind of inward-looking, relatively isolated power to becoming a country whose consensus, in the elite at least, is that everywhere is an American national interest. Everywhere is an American national interest. And secondly, they have built global networks, intellectual knowledge networks in key strategic states and regions of the world, and built up over many decades the entire infrastructure of these elite knowledge networks of universities and so on and so forth. And in the book that we're referring to, I have chapters on Nigeria, on Indonesia, and on Chile. I've done more recent work on India and the Ford Foundation, for example, and the role of the Ford Foundation in post-Mao China in the transformation of economy. And you see the power of that knowledge. It is not just such ideas, it's real, it's tangible. It's tangible in the transformation of a particular kind of political economy into another one. That's not to say that China and India would not have done some of those sorts of things in the absence of those institutions, but it would have taken a lot longer because these external institutions like Ford and many, many others, they funded the think tanks and the studies, and they trained the economists and others in China, in Canada, in the United States, and so on, built the networks, which then created the climate of opinion for more radical economic transformational change. So they take knowledge power very, very seriously. And if you can control what people think, how they think, and what the questions are, you have an empire of the mind. And that is, I think, part of the secret. And the network, the sort of sustainable long-term investment, material investment in ideational production and the production of useful knowledge, which policy entrepreneurs then convert into technology of power, that really is the kind of, I would argue, empirically speaking, the sort of secret of that kind of US as a global superpower and as a global kind of hegemon. And in effect, it has created that. But on the other hand, we all know that there's resistance. It may not come from ideas in the first instance, but it comes from the very fact that some people are excluded from the benefits of this so-called American hegemony and so on and so forth. And they will resist because their economic interests are not, they're suffering misery and degradation and oppression or violence and so on. That is, they have a material base upon which to think again, think differently, question and protest and resist and so on. So it's not like the United States operates in a vacuum in which it has created the entire world. It also has, if you like, it produces its own opposition too. And it can sometimes create that very opposition within the institutions they themselves have established. That is to say, they don't have total control over how people think, because people can always think differently as well, and they can read outside of the kind of norms that they're trying to establish. So I'll leave it at that, and if people have questions later on, and I'm sure you want to hear Dr. Waqas now on more local, speaking about the Pakistan itself. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's always fascinating hearing you, Inderjeet. Even, it's even better than reading you, because when you say, I mean, just a couple of clarifications, not a clarification, but a little explanation on 3 points. And I want you to keep those 3 points in mind when I talk about Pakistan later on. So, for example, Inderjeet said that, it's not flawed. It serves the purpose of elites. And I believe that international relations, because it was primarily built to serve the purpose of elites, it has continued doing it wherever it has gone, in whatever locality it has gone. So, for example, even in Pakistan, international relations serves the elites through the endorsement of state interests and the endorsements of state policies. So the problem was not with whether Western knowledge is flawed or not. The problem is that wherever it goes, it serves the purpose of the elites. And because those elites are networked across the globe, so it is kind of a servitude to a global capitalist economy where knowledge is regulated as a product, and these elites are, they sell that product to achieve certain aims. The second was the thing that Inderjeet said was that the elite network, it derives certain concepts and then it repackages it and sends it. And I'll take you back to 2000 when the concept of the failed state started emerging. So, since 1990 till 2000, failed state as a concept was not really, it was pretty immature, was pretty premature, in the sense that, it was the first time that the word failed state was coined, the term was coined was in 1993. And that too in a foreign policy magazine by 2 authors who were American bureaucrats, Hellman and Ratner. But till 2000, it had no currency. And come 2001, when the war on terror began in 2002, Condoleezza Rice said that we are threatened more by weaker states than by stronger ones. And the failed state then became the center focus. And then the Carnegie Endowment and the Fund for Peace came up with the failed state index, 2 big American think tanks. They came up with the failed state index, and they packaged the whole failed state index in a way that every year, whenever there was this ranking that would come in June, there used to be a plethora of editorials and talks about the failed state and Pakistan being a failed state. And then, with the Pakistan failed state, you club the nuclear issue and the military state issue, and then, you get this huge monster of a country. And that served the purpose because nothing actually worked on failed state, even though the belief that the failed states should be given aid so that they stop being failed. And if they stop being failed, then they'll be secure states and they will not threaten American interests. But surprisingly, from 2004 to 2012, no foreign aid was given to Pakistan in terms of its state failure. It was given as a strategic tool to, maneuver Pakistan's policies around the Taliban and so on and so forth. So yeah, so these 2 points. What I would want to do is, so I want to give you a little background about how, because there's a writer, Gross Fogul, and he is a Spanish, and he makes an observation. So he says that most of the South Asianists and most of people who are working when they're in their own countries in different disciplines, they study about the subaltern, that is about their own locality, but they don't study with and from a subaltern perspective. So what I want to do here is give you a study from a subaltern perspective, from a Pakistani perspective, rather than giving you a study through a conceptual or a theoretical. And another author, Tuckner, says that in order to talk about international relations in non-Western localities, the first thing that we need to do is to what Santos called take on the epistemology of the South. So instead of looking at international relations from a objective and a distant point of view, you place yourself in the middle of international relations as a discourse, and then you look around, giving a voice to the subaltern. So when I started studying international relations, as most South Asianists, my first encounter was with realism. And realism spoke about state sovereignty and anarchy and hard power. And when I was writing my first book on state sovereignty, the problem was I could not mitigate the idea of the equality of states, because in realism, you, especially the dominant mainstream realism, you don't get to talk about the equality of states. So, but when you look at the way state sovereignty is operationalized, for example, Pakistan's state sovereignty against China is a different phenomena, as opposed to Pakistan's state sovereignty against India, as opposed to Pakistan's state sovereignty about towards the United States. You see three different operationalizations of state sovereignty. So within the realist thought, then how do you encapsulate how a state can operationalize state sovereignty differently? And from there, the idea that state sovereignty, why are we so concerned about state sovereignty? And that led me to the second book, which was who writes about state sovereignty? And where do we get this information about state sovereignty and about international relations and national interest, so on and so forth? So I started looking at knowledge production as a process. And even then, when I was looking at knowledge production as a process, I was deriving a lot of literature from Derrida and Foucault, and I was talking about discourse and critical discourse analysis. But there was a kind of a paradox there, because I was trying to say something that was non-Western, but I was saying it in a very Western way. And, I felt very guilty about it, because at one point I was criticizing Eurocentrism, but I was using Eurocentric methodologies to criticize Eurocentrism. And that guilt, that intellectual guilt, made me look at different other concepts to find my place as an international relations scholar in the Pakistani society. And that led me to what I'm going to talk about now. So I started looking at, there's a Peruvian sociologist, Quijano. He talks about a colonial matrix of power. So the argument that he, Grossfogel, and Mignolo build, Walter Mignolo, they built that there is a difference between colonialism and coloniality. So colonialism, the way it's a myth, so according to Grossfogel, there's a myth of decolonization. For instance, for Pakistan, 1947, decolonization was a myth, according to Mignolo. And why was it a myth? Because except for the territorial independence of Pakistan, nothing else actually changed. The colonial matrix of power that exhibits itself through the coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of power, coloniality of gender, these things come together in that matrix of power. That never changed. So the reality of what was is not really different from the reality of what is. The same hegemonic processes through which as Inderjeet spoke about the empire of mind, Gildia talks about the empires of the mind, Gacini talks about the cognitive empire. And what these guys argue is that, 1940s was not actually the dissolution of the empire. It's a myth. The empire never dissolved. Instead, the empire was was constituted of two different elements. One was of territorial conquest, in which it maintained colonial administrations within the colonies, and the other was a cognitive empire, the empire that dominated the cognitive space of the colonial. So while the deterritorialization that happened in the 1990s only signifies the removal of the colonial administration from the colonies, except for that, nothing has actually changed. We are still part of that colonial system that existed maybe we were part of the continuity of coloniality that has been happening from the last 400, 500 years globally. So when we take categories the way we in Pakistan normally take of when we look at realism, we look at liberalism, or we look at other theoretical frameworks, what are we doing? We're looking at from an outside, objective, unbiased perspective. But that objective, unbiased perspective, what it does is it takes your voice away and your position as part of a subaltern group dominated by coloniality. And the reason why most of you are international relations graduates, and you've studied international relations maybe in the past 5, 10 years, you will find out that there's not much colonialism or imperialism taught even in our classrooms. And I looked at the Higher Education Commission's course outline on Introduction to International Relations, which is a course that I was teaching. And I found out that even the period, from 1919 till 1945, the history, it's a period of history of international relations, that's the course, that's the module. It was always talking about great powers, relationship between great powers, the evolution of American democracy, the alliance against. It never talked about what was happening in the subcontinent, for that matter, from 1919 to 1945. And the reason why colonialism and imperialism was never taught was because an author, Dietmar Rotherman, says that what happened was that when the colonial administrations left, the indigenous elites came into power and occupied the similar positions. And they did not change those positions because changing those positions or changing the concept of those positions would have changed the power structure in the society. And that might have contributed to them losing part of their power. So a consolidation of power by the indigenous elite meant that the myth of decolonization and deterritorialization should be maintained. Now, the international relations scholar at that particular point in time also found no use of colonialism and imperialism as analytical categories, because they were already trying to protect the state, which is nascent. So in 1947 and 1950, if you look at the scholarship by Pakistani authors, the nationalist scholarship that was coming out of the Pakistani scholarship, international relations, was largely defending Pakistan's national interest vis-a-vis India, was defending Pakistan's state sovereignty, because at that particular point in time, the international relations scholars thought that it was more important to defend the nascent Pakistani state rather than to go deeper into its international relations of the subaltern. And because of that, the trajectory that it took, and later on, when so for example, Zedi writes in his editorial in 2002, he talks about how from the 1950s till the 1960s, the American capital of Karachi, which was later turned to Islamabad, was dominated by American social scientists who would come and teach, and they would kind of structure the academic outlook of Pakistan. And so you have no mention of colonialism or imperialism because you've been taught that they hold no relevance to your life. And it's something that has happened in the past. However, I believe that the only way forward for international relations in post-colonial societies is to actually look and trace the colonial roots through the and how the colonial matrix of power has affected the way we think. So now, if you say to if you delivering an argument in international relations to somebody, and you say that my argument is not objective, it is subjective because I am speaking from the position of oppressed, it's not considered real scholarship. You'd be dismissed immediately. So Pakistani international knowledge relations, the localizing idea of international relations, as far as Pakistan is concerned, should be to move in the direction to unravel the coloniality of power and knowledge so as to unravel the ideas that continue to dominate how we think about them, and in doing so, maybe explore those marginalized knowledges that may exist in the corners by forgotten scholars and bring them out as part of an indigenous voice on international relations. So I think that should, sum up. The rest we can take up on question and answers. So thank you.
You, Dr. Waqas. Thank you, Dr.
You're not audible. I'm sorry. If you could get a mic close by. Thank you.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
All right, let's put it. So, Dr. Inderjeet talked about how the Western knowledge is not monolithic or homogeneous. And he talked about how it has been created in an Anglo-American manner. And he said that we need to ask questions about knowledge produced for whom, by whom, and about what. He talked about knowledge is not necessarily flawed, but it serves certain kind of interest. There is a contestation ongoing in the form of information wars, media wars. We talked about empires of the mind, quite an interesting concept, something that we need to explore further. And we talked about how knowledge production is a deeply political process, how knowledge becomes the basis of materialism. Over to you then, Dr. Waqas. You talked about how the knowledge production IR is flawed and serves the purpose of elites. If you were talking from a Pakistani perspective, I understand you talked about how it is used to endorse elitist policies using servitude for global capitalist economy. And you talked about your own experience when you were studying international relations. You talked about how we as students generally start from realism. And then you situated yourself, you talked about, while talking about subaltern perspectives, you talked about how we need to place ourselves in the middle of discourse and understand and try to contemplate on things. And paradoxically, we use Eurocentric methodology to criticize Eurocentric knowledge. We talked about it. So I can understand, I acknowledge the use of word flawed that we use in the title. The purpose was to expose the contradictions inherent in the Western knowledge and gain a base understanding of how it is created. So I can understand that it perhaps rubbed you off in a wrong way. We didn't mean that the Western knowledge is entirely flawed, but yes, there are certain contradictions. And it is more about creating that sort of critical consciousness so that we can talk about these contradictions and we can sort of explore these contradictions in social sciences, in political science, when we talk about economy, we need to understand these contradictions when we read and talk about them. So now I will be opening the floor for Q&A sessions, and my colleagues have prepared some questions beforehand as well, and they have, I'm sure they must have noted down some of your points, and they would have some new ideas related to what to ask. So I'm opening the floor now. maybe Faria, we can start from yourself, and or maybe Tasi, you have any question that you want to ask? You can introduce yourself and then ask the question.
My name is Dr. Taseem Javed, and I'm working in the research associate here. And I want to ask the question, same question from both of you. In this discussion, how would you address the problem of captive mind syndrome in the production of the knowledge in the South Asia? This is my question.
Maybe we can take one more question as well. We can take one more question as well, and then both Dr. Inderjeet and Dr. Waqas can comment on that, and then we'll go further. Please, Faria.
I'm Farha. I'm an associate editor at the center. My question is, what role does language play in limiting the depth of understanding in Western knowledge about South Asia?
Inderjeet, do you want to take this?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the first one.
Okay.
In terms of captive mind syndrome, you see, the fact that you use that term, captive mind syndrome, means you've already stepped over a particular boundary. You've already recognized that there was a boundary in which there's a sort of, not necessarily captive in the strong sense, but certainly you're bounded in your thinking, and particularly bounded in your questions, or what you think is a legitimate question to ask. So once you recognize the captive mind syndrome, if you like, you've already stepped over a boundary, and you know there are questions that have yet to be asked. And I think that's the important thing, is to ask questions which come from particular perspectives, which illuminate other dynamics in a social or political or intellectual or economic environment, in which, you know, you have to ask yourself a big question: what is my knowledge for? For whom am I producing this knowledge? Am I doing it as part of a system of knowledge production by a foreign affairs ministry, or a think tank which is associated with the military, or a university department which is dominated by militarized thinking? If you're producing knowledge in that, then the captive mind means if you want to keep your job, you're going to have to produce knowledge which is well, otherwise you'll be out. But I think if you can, the key thing about it is there are plenty of people who recognize the captive mind syndrome, but we are relatively smaller in number and less resourced. And the consequence then is that what are actually very compelling and persuasive ideas, and it probably would resonate with far more people outside of academia and the kind of intelligentsia and so on, because they are ideas for the populace. They don't get out very much because the institutions of knowledge production and the institutions of knowledge dissemination are in the hands of those same people who fund the production of knowledge in the first place. I mean, I can have a really good idea. I could write a really good book, which I believe I have. And how many people are going to read it? It's not going to be on CNN tomorrow and say, oh, look, we've exposed the entire system of Western and American hegemony and knowledge production in these networks. And guess what? CNN is a part of it. They're not going to do that. I mean, if they do, it'll be at 3 o'clock in the morning when nobody else is awake. Then they can say, see, we do open ourselves to critical ideas. So captive knowledge and captive mind and so on is that which you want to break down by asking questions which have not been asked. And from those, as my colleague said, I said, from the kind of subaltern or those who are marginal, excluded sort of positions. And that does take large resources to build it over time as well. So yeah, that's what I would say to that. I give my colleague what he wants to say now.
It's not that you rub the wrong way. It's just that you have to understand that no knowledge, I mean, even when you say Western knowledge, no knowledge is flawed. And so knowledge that was built by, or knowledge that was constructed, or knowledge that was progressed by the West, whether it's the United States of America or the British, was actually in service of their people and their empire, and it serviced them well. So as far as they are concerned, knowledge served them well. whether it was because of creating racial hierarchies, whether it was because they could use it as an apologia to invade colonies. In any way, it served them well. So in that instance, Western knowledge is not flawed. The flawed part is when you uncritically import it and imbue those ideals and project them. Then it becomes flawed in the sense that it creates this contradiction between the being, which is you, located within the Pakistani International Relations Academia, and the knowledge, which is absolutely disassociated from your being and is being imported. At that juncture, it becomes a flawed enterprise. Okay. As far as the captive minds are concerned, I mean, there are many people who've spoken about it. For example, Pike talks about colonized mentality. Altbach talks about the servitude of the mind. Gukume calls captured intellectuals. And yes, till the time, the ideals that we take from the West in terms of concepts and theories continue to dominate the way we think, we continue to stay captive minds. The question is not about whether we are captive minds or not, that we are. The question is that how do we get out of it? How do we get out of an epistemology which we have started believing as an ideology? How do we get out of an ontology which we've started believing as an ideology? I mean, so for instance, how do you get rid of the fact that you are equally a part of the problem, not disassociated from that problem? So as I said, the way forward then is probably to start changing not only the way we knew knowledge, but redefining what knowledge means to us, which takes back to what Inderjeet said. I mean, the first question we need to ask ourselves, what purpose does this knowledge serve? You write for the CSCR magazine, what purpose does it serve? You read a book and you start writing an article, what purpose does it serve? And to whom are you addressing that article? Because according to the latest census, not more than 10% of Pakistanis can read and speak fluent English. And this brings me to the second question. I mean, much of the I was talking to my undergraduate class and I asked them, I said, is your entrance examination, in the social sciences based on English? And they said, yes. Then I said, it's a testimony of your English language ability rather than your critical thinking ability. So whenever you're reading and writing, you are writing within a 10% of people who are actually well-versed in English as a language. But when you're disseminating that knowledge in English, you're even cutting that down because not a lot of people are going to read what you've written. So what happens is that because of this language barrier where most people are not well-versed in English, knowledge then, and we as knowledge producers then are complicit in producing a certain class. A class of English-speaking, English-writing, self-serving intellectuals for whom an intellectual activity is only reduced to circulation of knowledge within the 0.1 or 0.01% of people. And that's all that it serves. So language then plays a very important role. Now, another example I'll give you is that if, for example, if you go to England, anybody, for that matter, can walk into a bookstore, pick up any book and start reading. Can you do the same in Pakistan? So for example, you walk into Said Book Bank, you don't know English, what are you going to do? So that means that you've already disenfranchised more than half of the population of the country from any knowledgeable activity. So you're reducing that knowledge to only what they hear on the radio or on the television shows, and then you can't expect them to intellectually, break free of that cage of thinking, because that process continues repeating. When an Urdu-speaking person sees a class of English-speaking people who are doing better, would send their children to English medium schools because, proximity, and so on and so forth. So language plays a very big role in this knowledge production process, especially in Pakistan's case.
May I just please give a really good example of how captive minds can be shifted. Last year, we held a conference at City University. We invited Ahmed to speak. It was a 3-day conference on liberal internationalism and all this kind of thing. And he spoke from Pakistan, right? He was in London, he spoke. And there was a deadly silence in the room because we'd all Western scholars or Western-based scholars, basically. Many very critical. But when you hear what the liberal order looks like from Pakistan, it's very, very different from when you read about it in a library, which is well stocked in London or New York or whatever it is. And I think that is the answer to the captive mind problem, is more voices from more places, from places among people who don't sit in the same room together. And they don't hear, therefore, that you could even think in a different way. And the key thing is very often we don't even know the facts, forget opinion. The world is so rich, the world is so vast and diverse, complex, that to empirically know it, or even a small part of it, is almost impossible for a single individual. It requires a collective study, a sort of combined study of many, many people, even to understand one small process in one country, let alone in world terms. So bringing those global voices together and recognizing that there is no Pakistan or India or Indonesia or Mexico, but there are many Pakistans and many Mexicos and many Indias and so on. And that we need to hear about what is the experience of India from 100 different voices, not the same people who get on the television all of the time. And I think that is democratizing knowledge. It democratizes our experience. And it says, wow, these people who lived in this so-called failed state or this terror state, actually, there's a lot more complexity there. Simplicity is a means of control so that you can say, that's the problem, they're rogues, terrorists, whatever it might be. And it's a way of deploying power to make sure that basically you stay in charge. But breaking that, I think, is now technologically more possible than it used to be. The global pandemic did one thing. It made us all aware that there is this thing called Zoom, and that we can, from many different places, all be in the same room, even though we've never met each other, but we can hear what people have to say, what they think. And I think that's the great democratization which is going on. And that is the source of the crisis, or legitimacy of elite power everywhere. Established parties, established leaders are losing legitimacy and support practically everywhere, and are resorting more and more to divide and rule on one side and authoritarianism and coercion on the other. And that is why, because people have different ideas based on their life experiences. And so I think kind of, if we as knowledge, we think about knowledge and we problematize knowledge, I think it's our duty to open up the spaces for thinking and getting to know facts, education, and so on in a democratic kind of way. And I think that's one of the great important missions we must have as knowledge institutions, is to open up the doors of the university to the people who live in the block of flats next to my building that we never speak to. And they come from everywhere in the world, just 200 people across the road from where I'm sitting now, but we don't know what their voices are. And I think that is what the mission has got to be. So that what you may then conclude is up to you. Whatever you want to take from it is up to you. But at least you now know that there are other ways of thinking, the other experiences, that the whole world is not like me, getting a nice job, salary, blah, blah, comfort, and so on. But there's a lot of people out there, because in the end, those discontents are going to come knocking on your door as well, because you're part of the problem, because you're within that captive mind and you're producing for that captive mind. But that doesn't serve the majority of the population in most countries. So I think as knowledge institutions, that is, I think, in our own area. And the last thing I would say is that although I might have painted a picture of these monolithic hegemonic institutions, inside those hegemonic institutions are ordinary people who are thoughtful and so on, and they have their own ideas. And there are a lot of people who may work in a military bureaucracy or a foundation or a think tank who don't actually agree with what the military or the think tank or the foundation is doing. And so we as scholars and so on, who produce knowledge and so on, we should build relationships and alliances and so on, because there are people everywhere who don't necessarily agree. I don't agree with every single part of the mission of City University of London. Why would I? You know, some of it I believe is actually damaging. But in the university, you can more or less speak as you see fit, usually. Apart from today, of course, about Hamas and Israel and so on. You see the captive mind imposing itself. So I think it's not like there's knowledge, democratic knowledge out here and then the bureaucracies. Actually, I think there are a lot more kind of possibilities of overlap and interaction as well, with the same idea that you can empower those individuals who have knowledge from within, but who can't speak, by asking questions about it and looking for evidence about it, which you then can publicize and thereby begin to disseminate it, and that can have a political effect.
Thank you. Two more questions. Now speak.
Right. So both of you distinguished speakers talked about Western knowledge not really being flawed, but actually serving the interests of the Western elite. But isn't it at least self-contradictory? And isn't it really disassociated from these Eastern societies where the interest of the Western elite lies? For example, when we see the Western discourse, the Ukrainian militant is a resistance hero, and the Palestinian militant is a terrorist. So isn't this self-contradiction and this Orientalist view of the Eastern societies and this disassociation, isn't that really a flaw?
Thank you very much. My name is Abdul Base, and my question is, how did China manage? Like, we always talk about power knowledge nexus, but how did China manage to get out of that and to get a lead against the West, because it is an Eastern society? Thank you.
Right. Could I please take the China question?
Sure.
I think that's a really great question. And what it goes back to is this idea that there are hegemonic forces, ideational, material, coercive, and other, but they don't necessarily, not everybody necessarily agrees. And so therefore you can have counter-hegemonic knowledge coming out of that too. But I think the more complex answer is really that China is a big, great power. It's a huge country with huge resources and possibilities. And it was in a position, not like a kind of relatively weak state compared with the United States, but it was able to, it exercised agency. It picked and chose whom to invite in, whom to listen to, what kind of things to enable them to implement and support as a state and an education system and a political party and so on. That is to say, because of their agency, they were able to have a much more powerful negotiating position. And because of their agency, they could not be imposed upon. It's an ancient civilization with a huge intellectual civilizational history. They are not, weak on PhDs. They're not weak on knowledge and thinking and philosophy and so on, as well as they're a very strong state in the sense that the Communist Party and the party state is incredibly strong. The second thing, of course, is that China wanted something from the West. Is something wanted to be, if you like, integrated into the liberal international order. It wanted to open itself up. It chose to do that, but it went shopping. It went to Hungary, it went to other parts of Eastern Europe, they went to Japan, Canada, United States, Germany, UK, and so on, looking for ideas to how can you be a particular kind of political economy, and they came up with it, sort of market economy with Chinese characteristics or whatever it was. And even today, if you look at, if you go down the Cold War route, the sort of so-called second Cold War 2.0, I think you miss what is really going on, which is a massive level of interdependence in a whole range of domains between China and the West and other parts of the world as well. There's geopolitical rivalry, but there's actually vast amounts of Western and American investment in China and Chinese economy and so on, and a vast amounts of ownership of US dollars and so on in China itself. China cannot be allowed to just destroy itself or collapse. Strong China is actually an American national interest. That is to say, the ruling elites across the West and in China and in India and other places as well, they actually have a large amount in common. And they're sitting on top of increasingly unequal societies internally, but increasingly more equal elites externally. So they're presiding over these tinderboxes, cauldrons of resistance and discontent, and they share that in common to try to keep that suppressed. And why do they follow these strategies of divide and rule? I mean, China uses the whole kind of century of humiliation and that kind of thing in very nationalistic and very narrow kinds of ways to promote a particular kind of discourse as well. So that is to say that when you invest in an idea, you can also invest in just intellect in general, and that people can come up with their own ideas and resistances as well. But in the case of China, China has become very powerful, but then so did Western Europe after Second World War. The European project was an American project. The interdependence between them is there. Does that mean there's no rivalry? There's no competition? There's no contestation about trade and finance and geopolitics and the militaries, etc. There's plenty of it. And there is with China, but there's a huge amount of interdependence too. So I'd say there's a lot of performativity in the opposition between Chinese elites, Western elites, and so on, as well as various kinds of rivalries. So I would look to the work of Karl Kautsky from 100 years or more ago, where he argues about they're like cartels. They have some shared interests. They also have some competition between them. And they try to fix prices or markets or investment or whatever it is in order to try to better manage that so that the competition doesn't flow outside and become totally and utterly destructive of them. And so he says states do that too. Ruling elites do that too. And to some extent, you can kind of see that sort of process in operation.
Comment on this. I mean, China, so say if you look at those, for example, India is an emerging economic power, so is China. So you look at these emerging economies, one thing that you can see is that they followed protectionist policies till 1990s. So till 1990, they were close to Western imports and Western understanding. So you see a lot of socialist leaning of India that it, got from Nehru sustaining till the 1990s. And when they opened up to the 1990s and they entered the capitalist market, the Chinese did it on their own, as Inderjeet said, agency. They used their own agency of pick and choose. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, the Chinese never let go of their language. So whatever they did within China was within a language that meant equal opportunity for anybody who wanted to study or gain knowledge or who wanted to progress. So the language played a very important issue in which the entire society could actually compete on a certain level rather than a society like Pakistan where the language barrier continues to define different classes. The third thing is that the one party, the one communist party, has grassroots has grassroots participation. So, for instance, for somebody to come up, you have to start very low. So they're very integrated with the society in one way or the other. Unlike democratic elites or Western elites who are parachuted on top. So they're not really part of the grassroots, but through campaigns and funding, they come on and they parachute on top of the hierarchy. So that the Chinese model actually picks up a grassroots worker and slowly educates and through the programmatic evolution brings that person into a policy making or policy deciding role. The third key thing is that China never has not till yet weaponized the social sciences. So the way that the West has weaponized, for example, human rights. So there's for the audience, there's a very interesting book by Ido Oren on the weaponization of foreign policy. So you see that how social sciences has been used by policymakers and weaponized in a way to serve their interests. So you see the discourse on human rights, for example, or the discourse on failed states, for example, as a manifestation of that weaponization. But when you look at Chinese foreign policy and you look at Chinese social sciences, you really don't find that kind of weaponization there. So you see the two different ways in which knowledge then, that knowledge is everywhere. When I was at Sussex, there were a lot of Chinese students there studying international relations. But what inadvertently, whenever we would speak or even when they went back, they used to look at that knowledge from a very Chinese perspective of trying to understand things. And that is why when in 2008, 2009, Barry Buchanan Acharya asked why there is no non-Western international relations theory, at that particular point in time, the Chinese school of international relations was actually developing, and now it's a formidable school of international relations that draws a lot of knowledge from Confucius and Tao Tzu and their intellectual giants of the past. The problem with a country like Pakistan is that not only have you disassociated yourself from your previous intellectuals, you have disassociated yourself from the entire enterprise of colonialism. So even the history that is taught before 1947 is a history of Muslim League that came into power and then, helped. But beyond that, there is really nothing about colonialism or imperialism. You do not know which kind of intellectuals they were, what they wrote, what were their ideas. And those few who have actually written something, you have discarded them as mythologies or folklores. And there's a huge discourse, especially in the African sociology, where they've now started looking at folklores as, as an epistemic foundations of knowledge about that society. And from that, they've started deriving certain, inferences about society and how it has evolved. But we, for instance, in the subcontinent's tradition, one of the greatest folklores is Heer Waris Shah. But how many people would have studied Heer Waris Shah from a very knowledge perspective to understand how society works, how knowledge evolves, what are the intricacies and the complexities of them? So the problem with Pakistan, so we can't really talk about the Chinese model the same way we can't talk about the Indian model, because what I believe is that instead of globalizing international relations, we need to start provincializing it, because every place will have its own understanding of international relations. Maybe one monolithic big theory to explain everything is not necessary. You need small ideas that dominate small societies. So, so China is a very different model altogether when it comes to, knowledge and the production of knowledge.
More questions at the back? We have limited time, so no questions. Okay, so I think one question was directed at both of you gentlemen by Ali Afzal. He talked about flawed knowledge in a sense that the yes, he talked about the contradiction in terms of how we continue to describe in media in Western discourse about Ukrainian resistance vis-a-vis the Palestinian resistance. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think I would just go back to what I started with when I was talking, that it's flawed in the sense, I agree with you. The label of freedom fighter, terrorist, guerrilla, whatever it might be, or state, is applied according to where you stand in relation to that particular force. So I would describe people who fight against oppression, anti-colonial oppression, and so on. I would fight as kind of patriotic fighters for the rights of their country, people, and society, and so on. But if I'm in the government of that particular colony, I'm going to see that I am the source of order. I am the source of governance. I am the source of law. I make rules. I apply rules. Anybody who violates those rules is causing disorder and breaking laws. I would call them criminals or terrorists or anti-national or whatever it might be. That is to say, the label is not an objective label. It can never be, because the guerrilla fighter or the militant or the so-called terrorist, they will say, no, you are not going to delegitimize us by putting this label on us. So it's a contestation. And there is contestation. Not everybody agrees that what is going on in Israel-Palestine right now is only one-sided terrorism versus legitimate state forces or something like that. Even the mainstream media coverage has had to recognize that things have moved on quite a long way. Because Israel has been behaving in various kinds of ways, as we know about. But nevertheless, Israel is their ally. And by the way, Israel is the ally of a lot more countries than just Western countries. It's an ally of India as well, and Indonesia, and many others who they supply military weapons, they police training, riot control, all kinds of how do you keep populations down, which those governments and states, they like to do. The Saudis, the UAE, and others are making all kinds of agreements with Israel to normalize Israel, etc. They have been. Right. So the key thing is, objectively, there is no such thing as a terrorist. There's only who you say is a terrorist because they oppose what you stand for. So it depends on who has the right and power to define. And that goes down to who has the power to produce knowledge and then disseminate that knowledge, so that that conventional knowledge is that knowledge which you don't even have to go looking for. It finds you. So I wake up in the morning, I might switch on the radio in my car to listen to the news. It hits me in the face what is happening in Israel and Palestine. I don't have to go looking, I just have to press a button. I look on a website, I go on Google and say, World Affairs Today, it tells me what to think. It's everywhere. I don't have to go looking for it, it comes and finds me. But if I want to find somebody who says, come on, somebody who's actually been there and studied it in depth right from there, from some other perspective, I have to do a lot of research. And most of us don't have the time or the skill to be able to do that. And that's what hegemonic knowledge production really does. It makes it easy for people to just think conventionally, because you don't have to do any work. Everywhere you look, there's free newspapers. At every underground station, there's a free newspaper handed to you as you go in. It tells you, this is what's news. This is important. And this is how, who's a terrorist, who's a freedom fighter, who's right, who's wrong, and so on. You know, it's just, you breathe the air, you breathe the convention. If you want to find something alternative, resistance, and so on, you've got to go digging a lot further. And that's where the captive mind idea is quite an interesting one, because you don't believe you're captive. That's the problem. You think you're free. You think you're free until someone comes and says something which you didn't even know was a question or a perspective, and then you don't believe it. because it's so weird. But but as I say, there's contestation, and these societies, most societies, are unraveling because those conventional stories about everything, they just don't have as much legitimacy as they used to, because people's lives are not great, and their prospects are not very great either. All these major existential issues and problems which are going on around people force them to think and so on differently, and they withdraw their consent for it. So in that sense, I would say the term flawed suggests somebody made a mistake. They didn't. That's the point. It's not a bug. It's the point of that thing is to produce that.
I'll take you back to what Inderjeet said earlier, that you can't teach, you can't think that international relations is just one monolithic thing, or Western knowledge is just one monolithic thing. So, for example, even if you go on Twitter, you find a lot of academics, a lot of people who are professors, a lot of leftists, talking about Palestine, people talking about Ukraine from a subaltern perspective. You see that happening. It's the point is that then you have to make a distinction between two different kinds of knowledges, or three different kinds of knowledges, or four different kinds of knowledges, because when you look at government policy, it operates on a very different rationale, as opposed to what a professor is saying based on their research, or as opposed to a media person who's basing what they're saying on opinion. So, for example, as far as the rest are concerned, there is an industry, and that's what Inderjeet's been saying, that there is an industry that feeds into these ideas, that makes these ideas prominent. So the fact that you look at Israel and you say, oh, people defending Israel are more than people who are defending, why aren't people defending Palestine? That might not be the case, because maybe those who are defending the Palestinians on social media or so and so forth may not have had their voices, amplified to the extent that those who are speaking for Israel have their voices amplified. So when a state minister says something, of course, there's an amplification of that. Or when a professor says, or even I was looking at it, that even professors of Ivy League have a different, when they say it, it's really different from when those who are not in Ivy League say it. So there's a distinction in which these narratives happen. And again, it's a very complex web. At the end of the day, when we talk about international relations and we talk about localizing international relations, I'll bring you from the Israel-Palestine to Pakistan. What you're looking at, again, when you're looking at the Israel-Palestinian issue, is again from a very state-centric understanding of what it is, of what the whole situation is. You're not looking at your subjectivities as part of the international relations discourse that is constructing a certain idea about the Israel-Palestine issue. And how can you talk about the Israel-Palestine issue as scholars without actually having researched it from a way? So Israel exists, let's say, in only in a construction that has happened over time. And Palestine has happened in a construction over time. And that construction of thought is very subjective, and it is very centered on your being, because that is how you perceive it. You're a combination of your knowledge. So you're looking at things from that prism. May it be the Islamic Ummah, for example. May it be that, or Muslim Brotherhood, for example, or maybe you talk about regional alliances, but that knowledge episteme is very integral to your being. So international relations, then when we talk about decolonizing international relations, what I'm trying to say is put your being in the center of that international relations scholarship, rather than looking at it from your drawing room as a dispassionate, objective, unbiased activity. Only then will you probably come up with an international relations idea about Israel, for example, which is indigenous to your, thing. So.
And even that concept of objectivity is a subjective production, because it's embedded inside the meaning of objectivity, your interests. So you, in effect, are now claiming science impartiality, objectivity, no politics, no ideology, just pure correspondence between how you think and what the world is like. And you call that objectivity. But that is still not real life. But you can impose that view on life among enough people for enough time, but it's not going to last forever. You can make the colonized people believe they are inferior, they're incapable of governance and so on for a certain amount of time. But life itself teaches that this is not how it should be. And they're the people who get called terrorists. And they do use terror tactics as well. You know, they do blow up people and they can assassinate people and so on and so forth. Those are terror tactics. That doesn't mean to say that that's their mission is terrorism. That's an instrument. You know, like Martin Luther King said, rioting is the language of the unheard. But if you go to law and the law is a colonial law, you're not going to get too far. That means you have to go outside the law because the law is the problem. So, and that has claimed to be, you know, sort of objectively and whatever. So I think that concept of objectivity and its origins in kind of American and other social science is actually really interesting to follow through. And how it was constructed in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s to sort of manage massive social change and political change, industrialization, urbanization, mass migration. And we know 19th century Europe underwent bloody civil wars and revolutions and so on, and social science, and in the United States, the Civil War, so modern social science was born after that to try to manage and to prevent those kinds of outcomes and so on. And it was by elites to maintain certain kind of control. And so they outlawed certain kinds of knowledge as backward, pre-modern, not scientific, applying the rules of Darwinism and whatever, and so on. And they called that objective. And who funded those people? I mean, Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, the states, and so on. They built an entire infrastructure of knowledge production to embed that. And so that when you go to university, that's what you do. When you do study economics, you're studying objectively how the world of economy works. And it gets you a job as well, right? It gets you a job and a career. That's fine. You get your house and your car and your club and nice clothes and so on. It materially sustains you. But when you deconstruct it, you kind of see that this edifice is riven with contradictions itself. And they do unravel at certain points. And American social science and others and scientists very often rebel against the kind of oligarchical sort of established elites in those institutions as well. So, and that's why, if you like, I'm always impressed by the fact about the amount of resource that goes into knowledge production. It is absolutely incredible. Hundreds of billions of dollars and pounds are expended annually, and still there's resistance. Still there are critics. Still there are people saying, you are not objective. You are putting forward an ideological agenda. So with all that resource, it shows you how difficult it is to try to get control. Despite all that resource, if the opponents had anywhere near that level of resource, these people would be finished.
Thank you, gentlemen. It was a pleasure to host you. We learned a lot from this session. Me and my colleagues, I'm sure, will be more critical about how to frame our knowledge when we'll be writing about different issues, knowing the inherent contradictions in the knowledge which has been taught to us. We are grateful for your time once again, and we hope to continue our engagement with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated. And thanks for your attention. Once I get started, sometimes I just keep going. But I'm really happy that you invited me, and I'm so pleased to address colleagues who are so interested ask such good questions and so on. And I hope we have some events next week and the week after that about the Global South and so on. A professor from Brazil. I've sent, I think, to a couple of you already an email. It's available via Zoom and in person here in London. And I hope that you will, have maybe some time to join and join the discussion and put your voices and questions forward as well. Because I honestly believe it. I think those global voices, we don't hear enough of them, but they're the ones which make you think and maybe even change your mind about certain things. So hope we can continue our interaction anyway.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Waqas. Thank you so much for joining us.